First, I'd like to thank Father Steve for this opportunity, and also Brian for all he's done to make this possible. It's really amazing and beautiful to have such a series which celebrates the rich intellectual tradition of the church and her members. It's a privilege to be here and to be a part of that. And I think in talking about humility, you'll see that in a sense, the humble man really is Lumen Veritatis. Also, thanking Tom and Doug, who are not here, but for their hosting of us here at Lansing Catholic. And I would also like to thank Mother Assumpta and my whole community for sacrificing the income of a high school teacher and offering rather the price tag of a graduate education in philosophy at one of the finest institutions in the country, the Catholic University of America. And it really did form the way that I see the world. It really changed the way that I understand reality. And I'm very, very grateful. And one of the things that I began to see more clearly is that all-important and beautiful subject of human virtue, which is what I'm going to share with you tonight. I'm going to stick mostly to my notes because I have a lot I want to get through and I don't want to get sidetracked. And once we get to the handout, I'll let you know. I'm not going to go through the very top part, but I wanted to give you an outline of St. Thomas Aquinas's question on humility, which is what my talk will focus on. So tonight I will share with you the fruit of my study and meditation upon the work of a giant in the church's tradition and a Dominican brother of mine, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose constant reflection on truth, beauty, and goodness impacted not only the theological thought of the church, but also the philosophical thought of his time in revolutionary ways that continue to redound unto the present day. Before I begin in earnest, it is only fair that I warn you that I am no expert in St. Thomas Aquinas' colossal work and genius, nor on virtue in general, nor on the virtue of humility in particular. You can ask any of the sisters who are here with me about that. In fact, when I told Mother I was doing this, she said, "Hon, do you know anything about humility?" So, if you would like, you are free to leave and get some wine. In fact, on most days, you can find me down the hall discussing quantum numbers and periodic tables with 10th graders in the chemistry classroom. That being said, the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, haunts many halls and frequents every corner of the world where man struggles to realize who he is, what this world is, and ultimately who, capitalized, did it come from, and to whom, capitalized, is it going. In fact, I would argue that to be fully human is to be a philosopher. Those who avoid these questions avoid their own humanity and their very reality. Further, you see, to be human is to be automatically oriented to virtue, that is, the shaping of our desires in such a way that we act according to our reason, according to our end and our telos as human beings. Just like a squirrel has an end, which is to do squirrely things, a tree also has an end, which is to grow into a fully mature tree. So too you and I, as human beings, that is, as those creatures gifted with human nature, have an end. At the heart of virtue, then, to even begin speaking about it, we must all agree that, one, man has a nature that is both given and cultivated. And two, that man has a telos, an end, a perfection proper to his nature, that he can fall short of and that he can realize. If you don't agree with that, you should probably also leave. Also, though all natures have ends, telos, unlike squirrels and trees and all other material natures that we know of, we alone have reason, ratio, that extraordinary power which Aristotle describes as to know the order of things. As a side note, I think this is beautiful. He calls wisdom the ability to put order into things. Only we can know our telos as our telos and choose freely to act in accord or discord with it. A squirrel, despite the imagination of Pixar, cannot. A squirrel is directed by instinct to his end, but not us. We know the cause of why we act and the end for which we act. Thus, we can put order into our actions. We can choose to direct them for a good, our telos, happiness, and divine beatitude. In putting order into our actions, we do virtuous acts. And in putting order into our souls, we become virtuous men and women. Thus, every virtue, justice, temperance, prudence, fortitude, magnanimity, affability, gratitude, humility, is order in our souls, aiming our human powers, intellect, will, and appetite to our good, our end, our telos, our happiness. To be virtuous is to have shaped one's soul such that it undergoes all passions rightly, that is, in accord with reason's sight of the human end. So let's talk specifically about the virtue of humility. Definitions and characterizations of humility are abundant in literature, essays, and scholarly works. And yet the paradox that Christ teaches us by his preaching and his own life, that he who humbles himself will be exalted, remains an enigma. The essence of the virtue of humility often evades the mind's grasp, slipping into a delineation of unseemly characteristics, such as self-disparagement, inferiority complexes, and dejected self-abasement, which are more indicative of vice than virtue. This is not humility. Among the virtues, nonetheless, the virtue of humility is one of the most beautiful, attractive, and central to human excellence, a virtue that St. Thomas likens to, quote, the foundation which is first laid in a building. As Dietrich von Hildebrand puts it, humility embodies all the human virtues insofar as it is, quote, the precondition, the basic presupposition for the genuineness, the beauty, and the truth of all virtue. It is mater and caput, mother and fountainhead of all specifically human virtues, end quote. So what is the essence of this radiant virtue? In answering this question, I will focus principally upon St. Thomas's chief account of humility, found in question 161 of the Secundae of the Summa Theologiae. And I don't have much time to explain how the Summa is set up, but the central part of it is about man's return to God. So it goes through what is all of the parts of man, what are habits, which a virtue is a kind of habit that man has, and then it goes through a whole list of all of the virtues. One of my professors said that oftentimes this was used to help priests in the confessional. How do they give spiritual direction to their penitents? So really, I think these are very accessible articles. So if you're afraid of reading Thomas Aquinas, I would start with the middle. Just choose your favorite virtue. So it's great. Or your favorite vice. He also talks about those. I am afraid I must pass over much of the richness due to the shortness of time, but I encourage you to read on your own, not only what St. Thomas has to say about humility, but also about the incredibly wide array of other virtues which he treats. Tonight, I will attempt to describe how St. Thomas treats of humility as a special virtue, with a specific matter and form. In order to characterize humility, I will contrast it with another virtue, magnanimity, which St. Thomas interestingly and paradoxically associates with humility. He calls them duplex virtus, or paired virtues. Throughout this paper, I often return to a central component of St. Thomas's formulation of these virtues of humility, man's reverence for God as a creature for his Creator. This is the formal motive from which both the acquired and infused virtues of humility spring. I also won't have time to really get into the acquired and infused virtues, but that's the third chapter of my thesis, so maybe at another night, I don't know. The virtue of humility is conditioned by man's evidencing this relation between himself and God, insofar as man recognizes that he is nothing of himself and worthy of nothing, that all good gifts he has have their origin in God alone and not in himself, and that God is infinitely great and worthy of all honor and love. Insofar as he recognizes these truths, he is able, out of reverence for God, to moderate his desire for superiority according to right reason. Thus, the truth of this relation of creature to creator is the brilliant truth that the humble man evidences by his subjection to God out of reverence for him. The word evidence, used as a verb, takes on a special meaning in phenomenology. As Robert Sokolowski describes it, evidencing is bringing about of truth and bringing forth of a presence. It is a performance and an achievement. Evidence is the activity of presenting an identity in a manifold, the articulation of a state of affairs, or the verification of a proposition. It is the achieving of truth. So we achieve truth. We grasp it. It doesn't just fall into us. This is part of knowledge. That's why you can't just Google something and know it. You have to grasp it. Given this, although phenomenology and the scholasticism of St. Thomas approach the world from different vantage points, they are united in their conviction that human reason is ordered to truth and can achieve truth through its own powers. Given this shared conviction, I have included this term in the title of this paper to emphasize the fundamental relationship between the humble man and reality. Evidencing, taken in this sense, captures the phenomenon that man actively participates in the manifestation of the way things are. We do something when intelligible objects present themselves. We are not mere recipients. We are not only datives, but also nominatives of disclosure. So also the humble man is able to disclose this fundamental truth, making it intelligible to others through his humble way of life. So now I'm going to get into all of the intricate details. St. Thomas is famous for his distinctions. And so, and also he really just nails down what this virtue is by going through the matter and the form. And the matter has three parts: the matter in qua, the matter, immediate matter circa quam, the mediate matter circa quam. Okay, so the matter is the stuff about which humility works or does its work. But the form is more important. So the form is then the way in which humility actually acts, and it specifies what humility is. So the formal object and the formal motive, and the formal motive is the most important part. So you can follow along. I'll be going through these and distinguishing it from magnanimity. St. Thomas embeds his description of humility within a whole vision of the world, expounded in the Summa Theologiae. His particular treatment of the essence of this virtue is buttressed by his well-articulated understanding of other notions, such as habit, virtue, human nature, and God. St. Thomas employs these notions to articulate the essential nature of humility with a remarkable precision that does not mistake the secondary characteristics for those essential to its nature. In this section, I would like to do three things as I attempt to develop for you St. Thomas's characterization of humility as a special virtue in the human soul. First, I will discuss the matter and the form of the virtue of humility. Then I will consider the unique knowledge that is the foundation of humility. Finally, I will examine how this virtue of humility affects man's relation to his fellow men. So the matter of humility is what I'll start with. Firstly, St. Thomas places humility as a potential part of temperance, because humility shares the same mode as temperance, which is, quote, the restraint or repression of the impetuosity of some passion. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of impetuosities of passion, so. He further places humility under another of temperance's potential parts: modesty, modestia. And a lot of us, this calls to mind modesty in dress, but that is not what Thomas means here. He actually just means the restraint of some overwhelming desire. So in ordinary matters, not in more difficult to. So temperance focuses on food, drink, and sex, and then the modesty focuses on other more ordinary matters. In placing modesty under temperance, St. Thomas is following Cicero's lead. While temperance enforces reasonable moderation of those desires of the soul which are most arduous to control, namely the pleasures of touch, it is necessary, says St. Thomas, that there be a certain virtue to moderate in ordinary things, which are not so difficult to moderate, and this virtue is called modesty. Modesty, however, is a general virtue about ordinary matters, and thus has special virtues assigned to it, which regard particular ordinary matters. In the case of humility, the ordinary matter, moderated by this virtue, is the soul's desire for superiority. The Latin word there is excellentia, and I had a lot of discussions with my thesis director about the translation of this word, and we settled on superiority, and mostly because if you describe desiring to withhold yourself from excellence, that doesn't seem right. So even though that word seems like it should be excellence, in our language that doesn't quite fit, because you wouldn't tell anyone to withhold themselves from excellence, so rather from superiority. The special matter of this virtue has two pertinent kinds. First, the matter in qua, that is, the power of the soul in which the virtue is found, and this is the subject of virtue. St. Thomas places humility in the irascible appetite, the power of the soul which faces good, not as it is merely desirable, but as it is arduous and difficult of achievement. Many habits exist within each part of the soul simultaneously, however, and thus a further kind of matter must be specified, the matter about which, circa quam, a virtue is concerned. The matter circa quam has two parts, so hang on with me, please. Immediate and mediate. That upon which humility directly acts, the passion of hope, and that which is the external object that awakens that passion, which is excellentia or superiority. There are two movements or passions of the irascible appetite that surround the difficult good. Man is drawn toward the arduous good of what is great by the first, the passion of hope, and he is repulsed from the difficulty of its attainment by the second, the passion of despair. Humility's immediate matter circa quam is the passion of hope, since humility directly shapes man's soul to undergo hope in accord with right reason. The arduous good of great things, magna, is the mediate matter circa quam of humility, since the arduous good is what causes the appetitive movement of hope in the first place. Interestingly, there is another virtue sharing many of these characteristics. According to St. Thomas, magnanimity also shares with humility the same matter in qua, as well as the same immediate and mediate matter circa quam. As Aristotle does, St. Thomas explains that the mediate concern of magnanimity is what is great, since, quote, magnanimity is from its name signifies a certain extension of the soul to great things, end quote, and particularly the highest external thing which comes into man's use, namely honor, since it is awarded to the virtuous, to the best, and to God. The immediate matter circa quam of magnanimity, then, is also the passion of hope, which has the highest of great things, namely honor, as its object. St. Thomas directly associates superiority with what is great, saying that because magnanimity tends to what is great, consequently, the magnanimous man chiefly tends to those things which involve some superiority. Further, he says that the magnanimous man avoids those things that are contrary to his superiority or supremacy. Thus, the magnanimous man's pursuit of what is great has the further effect of causing his superiority, namely, that he is elevated high above other men. Though magnanimity and humility share the same mediate matter circa quam under the aspect of that which is arduous and great, St. Thomas makes a distinction between the scope of the mediate matter circa quam of humility and that of magnanimity. For the magnanimous man, the arduous good is the highest of great things, that is, honor. However, according to St. Thomas, for the humble man, the arduous good is all things. Those things which qualify as great and arduous from the perspective of the humble man include all good things, while those which are great and arduous from the perspective of the magnanimous man are only the most superior of good things. So you can see already the difference between the way these virtues view the world. St. Thomas states that humility makes man subject rightly and universally by the order of reason in all things, while every other virtue subjects man according to a specific matter. There is nothing that is not matter for the virtue of humility in the life of man, regardless of whether it is apparently great or small. At first, this expansion of humility's mediate matter seems to be incompatible with St. Thomas's determination of humility as a habit that regulates the irascible appetite, since this part of the soul aims only at those goods that are difficult to attain, not all good things. However, Cajetan, a 14th century commentator on Thomas, clears up the apparent contradiction when he writes, quote, "Humility directly regards all things, whether arduous in themselves or not arduous in themselves, but all things under the aspect of something arduous. For what is not arduous in itself takes on the notion of the arduous for the humble person, because it takes on the notion of the divine, since the humble address themselves to all goods as things that are God's." End quote. The humble man is lowly, and thus all good things are great for him, for all good things come from God. Now let us turn to the form of humility. Again, there are two aspects of form, the formal object and the formal motive, which characterize this virtue. The formal object is the precise purpose or end of the virtue, quote, "that to which it is immediately ordained," end quote. The formal motive is the special good which reason sees will be obtained by the practice of a special virtue. First, the formal object of humility is to temper and restrain the soul lest it tend immoderately towards superior things. The chief purpose of humility is to rightly curb the soul's desire for the lofty. However, Carlson, who is a Dominican who wrote on Thomas's exposition of this virtue, explains that while St. Thomas insists on humility's repression of hope as its foremost directive, it is secondary to the formal object of humility. St. Thomas identifies the formal object of humility as the reasonable moderation of the immediate matter circumscribed, namely man's desire for superiority. Since it is essential that humility moderates and directs the appetite, it is secondary that humility most often must restrain the appetite. There exists the rare man in whom humility must cajole him to pursue what is proportionate to his talents. But for most of us, humility represses hope or confidence in the self more than it makes use of them. So basically, the formal object is the moderation of the matter. And it's secondary that most often humility is restraining it. On the other hand, humility's formal object, while it's essentially also the reasonable moderation of the passion of hope, so they share the same formal object, they both moderate the passion of hope. Unlike humility, magnanimity secondarily confirms the desire for superiority. Thus, magnanimity is a potential part of fortitude in Thomas's schema because it shares the same mode as fortitude, namely firmness of mind, which is necessary in those virtues that tend to something difficult. Fortitude is the virtue that moderates the most basic desire of man to preserve his own life in the face of danger of death. The virtue of magnanimity is about man's more peripheral desire for superiority. Thus, both fortitude and magnanimity confirm and sustain their respective irascible passions. while humility chiefly suppresses and restrains the passion of hope, sharing the same mode as temperance. If both virtues essentially moderate man's desire for what is great and only secondarily restrain or confirm this desire, a further specification about what is essential to each is necessary in order to distinguish them as distinct virtues. Without a further formal characteristic, it would seem that humility is not a special virtue, but merely another term for the aspect of humility that restrains man's desire for what is great according to right reason. This is the argument of one of the objectors. So I haven't said anything about this, but Thomas's questions are set up where there are objections to begin, and then he gives his response. On the contrary, said contra, and then he gives his response, and then following he gives replies to all of the objections. This is one of the arguments of the objectors. In Article 2 of Question 161, Objector 3 argues that one virtue suffices to moderate the excessive contrary motions of the appetite. Quote, it pertains to the same virtue, both to restrain excessive pursuit and to strengthen the soul against excessive withdrawal, end quote. For example, fortitude moderates excesses in both fear and daring. Fortitude usually encourages fear and restrains daring in accord with right reason. Yet, in other instances, it may be necessary for fortitude to restrain daring and encourage reasonable fear in order to find the virtuous mean of action. Similarly, magnanimity moderates excesses in both hope and despair, usually confirming hope, but in certain instances suppressing it. The objector continues, quote, magnanimity strengthens the soul against the difficulties that arise in the pursuit of great things. Therefore, since humility moderates the appetite by restraint, humility is not a distinct virtue from magnanimity, end quote. Thus, the objector concludes that humility is merely another name for magnanimity's restraint of the soul's desire for great things. In response to his objection, St. Thomas explains that the distinctive formal motives for humility and magnanimity. If you are asleep or daydreaming, this is the important part. The formal motive is the heart of the issue. It's the very source of humility's beauty. It is the reason, ratio, behind humility's direction of the soul. It is the formal motive that is really the heart of virtue, the very reason that gives any virtue its characterization as a good habit, that about the virtue which is aligned with the telos of man. So back to Thomas's response. Firstly, St. Thomas points out that fortitude's moderation of excesses of both fear and daring is united by the same reason, the same ratio, the same formal motive, namely that man ought to set good reason above the danger of death, end quote. Therefore, there is only one virtue necessary to shape these passions, since there is only one formal motive, ratio. In the case of magnanimity and humility, however, there are two formal motives. Each virtue moderates for a different reason. For magnanimity, the formal motive is to encourage man to strive for his proper good according to his abilities, lest he fail to pursue a good of which he is worthy. For humility, however, the formal motive is subjection to God out of reverence for him. St. Thomas writes, quote, the principal reason for restraining the presumption of hope is based on divine reverence, which shows that man should not attribute to himself more than is competent to him according to his position, which God has allotted him. Therefore, it would seem that humility above all denotes the subjection of man to God. This is beautiful. Think of how the world would change if every man lived like this, that is, quote, according to the position which God has allotted him, end quote. St. Thomas makes the truly humble man's formal motive quite clear, stating it several times throughout his question. Further, St. Thomas is explicit that the root of the vice of pride is man's refusal to be subject to God. This was a game changer for me when I realized what Thomas was saying here. Humility is about me and God. It is not about me and her, or me and him. So I am a fool if I am ever proud. Think about it. Therefore, Joseph Pieper notes that humility is not primarily a virtue that regards human relationships, but looks principally to God, thereby preserving, quote, that which pride denies and destroys, the creaturely quality of man, end quote. With the form and matter thus delineated, the virtue of humility emerges as a virtue that moderates the passion of hope in man's desire for what is great, chiefly by restraint and according to right reason, out of reverence for God. After characterizing the matter and form of humility according to St. Thomas, I would like to turn to a consideration of the unique type of knowledge which humility requires as a foundation for action. A commonly recognized aspect of the virtue of humility is its special relation to truth. Humility is often defined as correlated with truth, or at least as conditioned by truth, in many scholarly accounts. At first glance, it would seem that the foundation of humility is that the foundation of knowledge is not particular to humility as a moral virtue. In fact, to know is required for all moral virtues insofar as moral virtue operates according to right reason. And yet, moral virtue remains in the appetite, not in the intellect. According to St. Thomas, each of the four cardinal virtues, taken in a general sense, contributes to the formal aspects of every special virtue. So prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance, all four contribute in a general way to all of the human virtues. As the chief of the moral virtues, prudence is right reasoning concerning things to be done, and thus is a principle for all virtues. Is there a special requirement of knowledge in the case of humility then? If right reason is a prerequisite for every virtue, what about humility's task? What is it about humility's task that requires knowledge in a way that distinguishes it from every other special virtue, that also acts according to right reason? What is the knowledge particular to humility that is so keenly required? In Article 2, the first three objectors assert humility is greatly concerned with knowledge, and is not, therefore, about the desire of what is great found in the appetite, but rather about the intellectual estimation of what is great, thereby suggesting humility's subject is not the appetite, but rather the intellect. In the Corpus, St. Thomas responds that humility consists primarily in restraining man from, quote, from being born toward that which is above him, end quote, and thus, properly speaking, moderates this movement of the passion, of the appetite. Okay, so humility shapes the appetite. However, he goes on to remark that for this purpose, man must know his disproportion to that which exceeds him, and thus knowledge of one's own imperfection pertains to humility as a rule guiding the appetite. In short, the humble man knows always and intimately his own imperfection. This self-knowledge about one's imperfection implies the comparison of two terms. If I am to be aware of my own imperfection, I must know myself as I am, but I also must know the one to whom I compare myself. According to St. Thomas, this one is God. In studying himself and comparing himself to God, the humble man comes to see his imperfection in relation to God, and thus is able to see rightly what humble position is proportionate to him as a creature before his Creator. In fact, in this comparison of himself with God, man comes to understand even his own finite perfections as relative imperfection before God's infinite perfection. This is the case even for the virtuous man. A man may be said to be perfect according to its nature, state, or time. In this way, a virtuous man is perfect. However, his perfection is found to be wanting in comparison with God. Further, any perfection that God might extend to man is completely gratuitous, and man ought to approach it as one unworthy but for the sanction of God himself, who gives all finite perfection as pure gift. In man there are two things, according to St. Thomas, namely, that which is God's and that which is man's. Whatever pertains to his imperfection is proper to man because of sin. Whatever pertains to his perfection belongs to God because he is the source of every good gift. Pieper sums up the self-knowledge proper to humility and derived from man's relative imperfection to God's infinite perfection. Quote, regarding God and its own creaturely quality, humility is an attitude of perfect recognition of that which, by reason of God's will, really is. Above all, it is the candid acceptance of this one thing, that man and humanity are neither God nor like God, end quote. Pieper suggests that the truth apprehended by the humble man's juxtaposition of self and God opens his mind to reality as it is. Not as we want it to be in our delusory dreams, for good or for ill, but as it really is. Thus, humility facilitates knowledge of all things. If the humble man grasps keenly this most fundamental of his relationships, that he is a weak creature of the Almighty Creator, then the order and the structure of the whole world are laid bare to him, and his mind is free to welcome the richness of reality. The proud man, on the other hand, overpassing the rule of reason, hinders himself from gaining speculative knowledge insofar as he has removed its cause, that is, God himself, since he does not subject his intellect to God. Neither will he submit to the instruction of others so as to gain the knowledge of other men, nor will he attain the knowledge of truth, since the proud, while relishing their own superiority, despise the superiority of truth. Hence, proud men are intellectually crippled, unable to fully exercise the human power of evidencing the world, of bringing to light reality as it truly is in all of its splendor, since they scorn what really is, replacing reality with their own finite fantasies. Does this sound familiar? St. Thomas is clear that the virtue of humility is not essentially in the intellect, because the formal object of humility does not consist in the knowledge, just the knowledge of one's own imperfections and the perfections and the comparative perfections of God, but in the application of this knowledge to both internal and external human actions and dispositions. It is not only that man knows his nothingness and God's perfection. That could lead to despair, I suppose, but he radically accepts them. Firstly, by acquiring the interior disposition of subjection to God out of reverence for him, and secondly, by approaching his own position in the order of creation as one unworthy. And I think I would add, he approaches his lot with pure joy and gratitude. He is happy to be what he is and to be it audaciously for the Lord, and celebrates what everyone else is and the role that they fulfill in God's plan. The more extensive this knowledge of self before God, the more humility increases, the lower man sinks in his own estimation before God to the earth. Garrigou Lagrange writes, humility is founded upon truth, especially upon this truth. There is an infinite distance between the Creator and the creature. The more vividly and concretely this distance is perceived, the greater the humility. However high the creature may be, this abyss is infinite. The higher one climbs in true progress, the more evident becomes the infinite character of this chasm. In this sense, the highest is the most humble because he is more enlightened. He goes on in that passage to talk about the Blessed Mother. The humble man is, then, the most capable of evidencing the truth, for he sees this most central reality and has joyfully aligned his life according to it, thus disclosing to other men by his very life the order of creation to its Creator. just taking stock. Okay. I have emphasized that subjection to God out of reverence for him is at the very center of Thomas's understanding of the virtue of humility. This motive is the essential form of the virtue that regulates the soul's desire for superiority and is founded upon man's knowledge of God's greatness and his own nothingness. With such a clear emphasis in the vertical direction, the question arises, does this virtue have a horizontal orientation? That is the humble man to be humble before other men? St. Thomas acknowledges this apparent conundrum in his account of humility through the first and second objectors of Article 3. The objectors contend that, since humility is chiefly concerned with subjection to God, it would seem that it does not require subjection to all men. In relation to God, one man's truthful comparison leads to an understanding of his own nothingness. But surely, in the truthful comparison of himself to other men, he ought to realize that he is superior, at least to some men, right? Thus, humility before all men would be vicious, delusive, and lacking in true self-knowledge. No account of virtue can be based on such falsehood, especially in light of the previous discussion that the rule of reason distinctly directs humility. Therefore, humility cannot concern interior subjection to all of one's neighbors, let alone exterior acts of subjection. Such acts can be appropriate regarding God alone. These are the arguments of the first two objectors. And if you have read any St. Thomas, he always responds on the contrary to all of his objectors. So Thomas's adept reply both preserves the formal motive of humility, subjection to God out of reverence for him, while extending its scope to include a qualified subjection to one's neighbor. He does this while also maintaining humility's essential foundation in truth. He responds that, since in man there are two things, that which is proper to him in himself, which is his imperfection, and that which is proper to God, that is, man's good and perfection. Thus, every man ought to subject himself according to that which is his own, to that which is of God in his neighbor. Notice that Thomas says we ought to revere whatever gifts of God are in our neighbor. Furthermore, we do this without falsehood, since if we compare that which we have of ourselves, our defects, with whatever gifts our neighbor has of God, we will know our own inferiority, and thus a reason to be subject to our neighbor. St. Thomas is clear, however, about the difference in the extent of reverence that the humble man has for others and that which he has for God. He says that not only is man's reverence for his neighbor a type of reverence for God, because he's revering what is of God in his neighbor, but also that it ought to be less in degree than the reverence he bears for God himself. Interestingly, St. Thomas changes verb tense in the corpus of Article 3 from imperative to conditional, how man ought to subject himself to his neighbor, to how man may subject himself. Though this conditional subjection is not required by humility, in fact, there is only one way in which man ought to be subject to his neighbor. As we have just said, he should subject that which is his own to that which is of God in his neighbor. St. Thomas says that in comparing his gifts from God to the gifts of God which belong to his neighbor, man is not required to subject himself. So the part of my gifts from God compared to your gifts of God, I'm not required to subject my gifts from God to your gifts from God. I found this really interesting because it's not what you think about when you think of humility. You think you just have to humble yourself before everybody. But he says, no, sometimes we need to prefer our own gifts out of humility because those gifts are from God, not as if they're from me, but as if they're from God. Likewise, the humble man is not required to subject what he has of himself, his sins, to the sins that are of others. So I don't have to go around proclaiming myself the worst of sinners. He need not regard himself the greatest of sinners. In both instances, St. Thomas, by adding the conditional sense of what man may do, implies possible degrees of humility among men in the extent to which a man subjects himself to his neighbor beyond what is necessary to simply have the virtue of humility. Given the correlation of truth and humility discussed, the man who has a greater degree of humility would also possess a greater degree of insight into the truth of his particular circumstances, those of his neighbor, and both of himself and his neighbor before God. Once again, the humble man evidences truth. As Carlson observes, it is to be carefully noted that humility never resorts to psychological sophistry. Though he must, as a minimum requirement of humility, subject what is his to what is God's in his neighbor, he also may, quote, without fear of violence to his judgments, believe himself the worst of sinners, end quote, since, comparing his share of good with his neighbor's, he may justly suspect that there is much good in his neighbor, even if he does not see it, which he himself lacks, though he may not and still possess a degree of humility. How is it that these higher degrees of humility avoid psychological sophistry? St. Thomas says that if the humble man, whose gifts are from God are, by all outward appearances, greater than those of his neighbor, places himself beneath that neighbor, his subjection does not require falsity. St. Thomas says that, quote, one may, without falsehood, believe oneself and pronounce oneself the most vile of all men on account of hidden faults, which he recognizes in himself, and the gifts of God which others have, end quote. I also had a lot of interesting discussions about that passage too. It's very interesting. Again, however, St. Thomas is clear that such an act of humility is not necessary in order to simply have the virtue to some degree. To conclude, St. Thomas says that the whole new law consists in two things, humility and meekness. Insofar as the spiritual growth of man is concerned, humility is foundational and holds the first place inasmuch as it expels pride, which God resists. Humility makes man submissive and always open to receiving the influx of divine grace. The splendor of humility appears most fully in the spiritual life. In his recognition and acceptance of his position within the order of creation and the workings of providence, man roots out the pride that hinders the very gift of grace, without which he cannot set forth in seeking his supernatural end. The utter nothingness that he is on his own in comparison to the sheer majesty of God, which he seeks insofar as he is able, according to his human intellect and the gift of grace. From this rule of reason, he responds by both interior and exterior acts of humility, which proceed from man's recognition of the greatness of God in himself and in his gifts in his neighbor. All these actions he does out of reverence for God in subjection to him. Thus, his whole being is a beacon, evidencing the most fundamental truth about man's authentic pursuit of human excellence and even transcendence, the truth of who he is, the truth of who God is, and the truth of the infinite distance between. The paradox is, of course, that the distorted transcendence for which the modern man thirsts is a pitiful imitation of the high perfection to which the humble man opens himself by his very humility. In light of Christian revelation, all men are called by God to indeed transcend the world by participation in the divine life. However, this will only be through our relation of ecstatic communion with the presence of God, person of God, and not by any amount of human willing and straining and otherwise conniving. No imaginary transcendence comes close to the pinnacle for which God has destined man, which is only available to the lowly ones who approach as those unworthy, relying on the grace of God alone to raise them up. Thank you. And now I think I'm supposed to see if there are any questions.
I have a question. You were quoting Piper,
Mm-hmm.
and you said something about nor are we like God. And then my question is, but we're made in the likeness of God. So could you
Mm-hmm.
make a distinction?
Sure. I think what he's saying there actually, one of the false understandings of how we can compare ourselves with God is that somehow there's a degree of difference between me and God, and eventually I could get there. So eventually I could become divine. Of course, we are made in the likeness of God, meaning that we have an intellect and a free will. We're able to see reality and to order our lives in such a way that we can either act in accord with that reality or not. But I think what he's saying there is God is wholly other. He is not a being in the world, and we are. So I think that's what he meant. Mm-hmm. Father?
So in the box on the back of the sheet,
Uh-huh.
you lay out morality, or humility is the moral virtue that moderates the passion of hope in man's desire. Can you talk a little bit about how we should understand the passion of hope? Is it like hope as striving or something like that? What is actually happening in light of his analysis of how is hope what is being moderated there? What is the passion of hope?
Mm-hmm.
How would you say it in other words?
Mm-hmm.
Do you get my question?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's the desire. It is just the desire that we have for any sort of excellence, any sort of accolade, or any sort of. This is something that I experience all the time. So the desire to do well, to be perceived in such a way. So it's not the virtue of hope, which is a theological virtue. That is a desire for God is the object of that desire, and it's a habit that we cultivate to continue in faith, to hope, to be in union with God. This is about more natural things for our own position, the desires we have for our own position. And all passions are good. Like, that's good. I should want to do well. I should want to achieve. I should want, because that is what God has created for me. He hasn't created us with these passions because they're bad. They are good. They just are a little out of whack. They're kind of like a bunch of screaming children that they just need to be cajoled. One of the images that I think, I think it was Aristotle. No, I can't remember now. But it's like trying to restrain horses and to get them to move in accord with what you're made for. So the passion of hope is any time that we desire our own superiority, our own accolades, our own position, our own status, I think.
Okay. No, I think you're saying that it really is about desire that helps
Yeah.
a lot. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Brian?
So my question, based on your reading of Thomas, could one who does not believe in God be humble?
Yeah, that's actually the second chapter of my thesis, which I didn't get to. So I argue that yes, I argue that not believe in God. Oh, I see, not believe in God. That's different. I argue that a pagan who, for example, Aristotle, who recognizes that there is some cause of his being, who really has thought it all out, but a person who does not believe in God, St. Thomas would say no, yeah, because you have no ground for that virtue. Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you don't recognize how much you are in debt of the God who created you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Father. So in the last chapter of my thesis, which I also didn't get to, I talk about the difference between acquired humility, which I argue for. A lot of people think that's crazy, there's no such thing, which would be like a pagan virtue of humility. And the virtue of humility that's practiced by Christ, by Mary, by all of the saints. This is not an optional virtue, people. Humility is not optional. It's not the most important virtue, but it's foundational for all of the others. Anyway, the difference between those is the recognition that, okay, so for the acquired virtue, God is my cause, but he's unattached, like he just plopped me, he had to cause me. It's one of these necessary things that I sort of spiraled out of him, and he doesn't really think about me anymore. But he's a great thing, and I have awe and reverential fear of him. And I know my own limitations because I'm aware of my own all the natural necessities that I have. The pagans' world is very different from the modern world, because the pagans all were aware of their own finitude. It seems like we're not anymore, or we're trying to we're trying to sort of forget our own finitude. But anyway, God just caused me, but he's detached. The infused virtue of humility, though, is very beautiful, because the Christian distinction, which Father Sokolowski, who I got to study with, he says, once we realize that God is wholly other from the world, and by the world I mean not just the planet Earth, but all of the universe. Once God is separate from all of the universe, he did not need to create this world. He didn't need to. That's what our faith teaches us. So this is completely and absolutely, utterly gratuitous. And a God like that demands a greater degree of humility, because a God like that, you enter into he's a person, and you enter into a relationship of love with him. And so your love and humility just grow and grow. And you realize not only that you were set forth, you were caused, but that absolutely you're dependent upon this God for your basic existence. He upholds you, and he has a position in mind for you. So the distinction between those virtues is really very beautiful. Yes?
So basically, you just answered my question. Without that relationship, that one-to-one love relationship with the God that we esteem, that we love, that we adore, we believe in, humility isn't possible.
Yes, I actually argue that it is possible, but it's not very impressive. Which is why I think Aristotle doesn't mention it in his Nicomachean Ethics. He never talks about humility except for one briefing passing comment. And so I make a big deal about this comment because I think, okay, there might be a place for it, but it's really not a big deal. Whereas in our understanding, now that Christ has revealed himself, has revealed God to us as one who is absolutely in love with us, and yet is all powerful and wholly other, and the very cause of we can't even understand him or get to know, really who he is in himself. We can't know that here. That's the God who calls us into relationship with him. And he's calling us he's made us his adopted sons. He wants to bring us into into union with him in heaven, to give us his own participation in his own divine nature. So yes, it's very, humility becomes something extraordinary with the revelation of Christ.
This is more of a comment, because I want to make sure I get the gist of this. So, as a human being, in pursuit of the virtue of humility, I need to be the best me I can be, but I can't do that without God.
That pretty much sums it up. Yeah. I really think so. I mean, it really just changes everything. It also takes away a lot of the stress, like, I am joyfully who you want me to be today, God. And I'm so glad that they're exactly who they want to be. It cuts out on jealousy. I mean, if we really believe that God created us and had something particular in mind for us, then we are celebrating the work that this other person does and not becoming sort of upset because it's not mine. I mean, that doesn't even make sense to a person who thinks like this. So yes. Mm-hmm.
So to gloss again, so humility is noticing that everything good in ourselves or anyone else is because of God.
Mm-hmm. And living that.
Just acknowledging that and appreciating it.
Yeah. Every day and in everything, yeah. Yes. When I realized what he was saying, I thought that really, it makes it a lot less complicated and very beautiful. So it's not, I mean, I really appreciated the notion that it's not about me and you. It's really not. But then it does, once I get myself in line with God, then it does become about me and you, but in a really happy and joyful way. I'm so happy that you're you, and I'm so happy that I'm me, and let's go to heaven. Like that's kind of what it is. You know? So. Mike?
Have you thought of any practical ways we can try to instill this notion of humility into like our families or children especially?
Well, this virtue is very interior. It really is. I find it hard to. I'd be open to your own suggestions, because when I think about that, I think about how I've grown in my understanding of this, and it's all from relationship with God. So I think the only way to do this, to instill this virtue in your children or in other family members, is to tell them about who God is, who God really is, and not the puppet God that atheists generally reject, but the one who is wholly other and wholly almighty and all-powerful, and yet intimately in love with us. It's extraordinary when you think about it. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. That is not the God I think sometimes atheists think they're arguing against another God, I think a lot of the times. But the one that is so completely other and yet so in love with us, we have to teach our children about that God, because that's the real God. And I mean that's all it comes down to, knowledge of God, and also encouraging your children to do well at what they're good at, and not get so distressed about what they're not. I see a lot of my students who, God bless them, they really try at chemistry, and it's really hard for them. And I say, you know what? It's okay that you're a C student. We need to tell our students that. We need to not make it such a big deal to fail at something, because we're not all going to be good at everything. We have our own gifts. We have our own position in the world to fulfill. So don't make your child into something that he or she isn't. Don't make them be something that they are not created to be. God's plan for them is so much better than your own for them, I mean, I think that's what it really boils down to when it comes to thinking about, even in your own life too. Don't make yourself be something you're not, Be who you are, because that's beautiful. That's what God's going to work in. And
I've always been taught children learn by example. Sometimes we give them the right one, sometimes we give them the wrong one. And I think my logic in this was always, Holy Spirit, if I do wrong, convict me, and then be big enough to go tell the kids, I made a huge mistake. I was relying on me,
Yeah.
not God. And, you got to erase that, but I said to take this new precept
Yeah.
I'm giving you now, because I realized, that was me, not God.
That's beautiful. Yeah, showing them that witness of humility.
Let's take one more question.
I encountered this story of Padre Pio, where a friend of his late in life was his biographer, made a comment to him one day about how the attention he'd gotten, he was very famous by then, must make it difficult for his humility. And hearing this, the saint laughed. He said, "What? Like, this had never occurred to him." And it strikes me in this discussion, and reflecting on the earlier question about something about how to cultivate it, it almost sounds like humility is this virtue that if you think about it a lot, you don't have it. And probably other virtues,
Mm-hmm.
and humility comes along.
Mm-hmm.
Fear of the Lord or something like that, what
Yeah.
would be
I think, well, I mean,
ultimate humility? How do I do it?
yeah, I think St. Thomas actually thought a lot about humility, and I do think he was humble. But at the same time, I think that's really beautiful, because a person who is humble is so enraptured in God. So, and also, it's the same person who's charitable. It's the same person. Thomas said, and this was so discouraging to me, so maybe I shouldn't say it, but Thomas says that all of the virtues are interconnected. And I thought, dang it, that means I have no virtues. I have none, So literally, if you don't have one virtue, you don't have any of them. That's what he says. And it's because the whole moral life is aimed at that one telos, union with God. I mean, for the infused virtues, So I think thinking about them is, thinking about what it is, and sort of struggling with that, and then trying to implement, getting to know who God is, and taking yourself before Him and saying, this is who I perceive myself to be. Is that true? Is this true? Like how I perceive myself, or are these some of my gifts that I don't have? And readily admitting admit your gifts. Okay, please stop hiding them under the bushel basket, because we need them in the church. So you need to admit your gifts, but at the same time, ask God to show you the gifts that you want, you really, really want, but you don't have, so that you can get over the delusion and maybe have a little cry fest and then move on. Because God has work for you to do, So that's what it is. It's like taking stock of who I am while I'm sitting in God's presence, knowing that He loves me, and then going out and still remaining in that presence always, and being the full version of myself that I am, for God's glory. And that's what I think St. Padre Pio, he was able to, his whole life was about God. So all of the stuff that they apparently achieve, they know that it's not enough, because they know who God is and who God has called them to be, and that they're still not meeting it. So that's why he laughed.